Scene 1. The abandoned park. Silence hung over the forgotten grounds like a heavy blanket. Silver Hollow Park, once a jewel of joy and entertainment, had now decayed into a landscape of rust and desolation. The wind whispered through the corroded structures, producing a sound reminiscent of distorted laughter. It was as if the park still held echoes of its former life. Fragments of voices and laughter trapped within the rusted beams and rotting wooden remains. The entrance, marked by wrought iron gates, was in shambles, hanging from rusted hinge. The gates swayed slightly in the breeze. Above them, a faded sign bore the inscription, "Welcome to Silver Hollow Park, where laughter never dies." But the letters were stained, some entirely eroded by time, as if the park itself wanted to bury its past. Inside the park, the scene was even more desolate. A giant Ferris wheel loomed over the horizon, its seats dangling from worn chains. A carousel, once spinning to cheerful tunes, now stood motionless, its painted horses frozen in grotesque, eerie smiles. Tall grass and weeds had overtaken the pathways, as though nature itself was trying to swallow the park in its darkened embrace. Legends claimed the park wasn't entirely abandoned. The townsfolk avoided even passing near it, insisting that something was wrong with the place. At night, some swore they heard faint laughter emanating from the heart of the park, as if someone or something was still playing inside. Others spoke of lights flickering unexpectedly on broken rides. Despite the absence of power for decades, what truly fueled the fear, however, was the story of Victor, the park's infamous clown. Victor wasn't an ordinary clown. He was the star performer of Silver Hollow, renowned for his daring stunts and his unmistakable grin painted in vibrant red, nearly dripping like blood. Victor was adored by children, but there was something about him that unsettled adults. A sense that his painted smile wasn't just face paint, but a mask for something far darker. His eyes, hidden behind pitch-black lenses, seemed to pierce the souls of those who stared too long. When the park abruptly closed, Victor vanished. The official story was that he left for another town, but the local rumors told a much darker tale. They believed Victor never left, that he became part of the park itself, a bitter spirit condemned to haunt the place where his life unraveled. Now, the park was merely a skeleton of its former self, but its presence was enough to make anyone's skin crawl. Those who dared enter felt an immediate weight, as though they were being watched. Even the natural sounds of the park felt twisted. The crunch of footsteps on the grass, the rustling of leaves, the creak of metal. It all seemed part of a macabre symphony. And in the middle of it all, deep in the shadows where Victor's old stage once stood, something seemed to stir. A faint glimmer of light reflected momentarily, as if something or someone was waiting patiently. Silver Hollow Park wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a trap for the curious, and those who ignored the warnings rarely same as they came.
Scene 2. The clown reveals himself. A strange chill swept through the air as footsteps echoed along the overgrown path. The atmosphere inside the park grew heavier, and the whispers of the wind took on an almost human tone. Anyone daring to cross the gates felt an invisible presence, as though unseen eyes were tracking their every move. But no one could be sure if it was paranoia or Victor. The rumors about Victor had many variations, but they all ended the same way: a terrifying appearance in the heart of the park. The few who returned from their ventures described a figure emerging from the shadows, his presence announced by sinister laughter echoing through the abandoned rides. Deep within the park, where Victor's old theater stage lay in ruins, the environment became even darker. The wooden floor was cracked, the shredded curtains swayed slightly in the breeze. And there, in the dimness, he revealed himself. A cold light suddenly illuminated the stage, exposing the grotesque figure. Victor stood there, his tattered costume still bearing the vibrant shades of red and yellow, now faded with time. The makeup on his face had peeled in places, but the grotesque red grin remained intact, stretching unnaturally wide, almost as if it were alive. His eyes, two dark voids, glowed with a malevolent intensity. In one hand, Victor held an axe. It wasn't just a rusty tool, it looked recently used. Thick drops of a dark, blood-like liquid dripped from the blade, falling heavily onto the ground, leaving stains on the stage's dirty wood. He gripped the weapon firmly, swinging it slightly as if testing its weight before striking again. The laughter began as a faint hum, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it soon grew louder, transforming into a horrifying cackle that echoed through the entire park. It wasn't a human sound, it was distorted like a broken tape playing in reverse. The sound reverberated through the abandoned structures as the lights on the rides flickered chaotically, reacting to his presence. Victor stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath his weight, but he didn't seem in a hurry. His movements were deliberate, almost as if he were dancing to some imagined tune. He tilted his head, his smile stretching even wider. Those who saw him claimed that, in his black, hollow eyes, they could see reflections of things not of this world. Visions of nightmares, silent screams, and endless corridors. He raised the axe, resting it on his shoulder, and pointed into the void before him, as though he knew someone was there. The wind stopped for a moment, plunging the park into absolute silence before his laughter exploded again, louder and more terrifying. Victor was on the hunt, and he had all the time in the world. Scene 3. The hunt begins. The eerie laughter faded, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The oppressive stillness felt unnatural, as if the park itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, stretching and twisting like living things. And then came the sound, a faint metallic scrape, like steel dragging across splintered wood. Victor was on the move. In the darkness, the flicker of faint lights teased at glimpses of his form. A flash of the axe's rusted edge, a sliver of his painted grin, or the unmistakable gleam of those hollow, glowing eyes. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every deliberate step seemed to echo louder than the last, amplifying the terror that gripped the air. At the center of the park, the old mirror maze stood like a monument to dread. Its glass panels were cracked and clouded with grime, yet they still reflected the ghostly remnants of the park's once bright allure. It was here that Victor loved to play his twisted games. Anyone who wandered into the maze never came out the same, if they came out at all. Inside, the maze was a labyrinth of distortion. The cracked mirrors reflected fragmented versions of reality, warping every movement into grotesque shapes. Footsteps reverberated endlessly, making it impossible to tell where they originated. Victor's laughter began again, faint and far away, but somehow it seemed to echo from every direction. Suddenly, his face appeared in a reflection. His wide grin stretched unnaturally, the crimson paint smudged and dripping. But when the reflection turned to look at you, Victor wasn't actually there. The mirrors played cruel tricks, but they weren't the source of the terror. He was. A sharp clang echoed as the axe struck one of the mirrors, shattering it into jagged shards. His distorted figure appeared again, this time closer. His movements were erratic, almost inhuman, as he lurked among the reflections. He wasn't just chasing. He was herding, guiding his prey deeper into the maze, where the mirrors multiplied his presence, making it impossible to escape. At the maze's center, the air grew colder, and the laughter stopped. Victor stood waiting, his axe resting by his side, the blade still dripping with that dark, ominous liquid. His black eyes scanned the reflections, as though he could see through the maze itself. And then, with one swift motion, he raised the axe high, shattering another mirror. The shards fell like rain, each one reflecting his grinning face. "You shouldn't have come here," his voice whispered, echoing in a dozen distorted tones. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. Scene 4. No way out. The maze seemed alive, its twisting corridors shifting with every step. Each shattered mirror reflected Victor's distorted grin, his glowing hollow eyes staring from every angle. The fragments of glass scattered on the floor crunched underfoot, their jagged edges reflecting pieces of his face, each more grotesque than the last. It wasn't just the sound of his laughter that filled the air. It was the feeling of being hunted. Victor didn't rush. He didn't have to. Every movement, every flicker of his figure in the broken mirrors seemed to pull his prey deeper into the trap. The maze tightened around them, the reflections multiplying, creating the illusion that he was everywhere at once. In one mirror, he stood perfectly still, his axe resting on the ground, the blade tarnished and ominous. In another, he raised it high, his grin widening unnaturally as though savoring the moment. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, plunging the maze into an unnatural silence. The air felt heavy, the absence of sound more terrifying than the noise. A single, deliberate scrape echoed as Victor dragged the axe along the ground, the sound growing louder, closer. The mirrors trembled, their surfaces rippling as though reacting to his presence. From the corner of an eye, his figure emerged, no longer a reflection, but real, stepping through a fractured mirror as if it were a dream. Shards of glass scattered to the ground, each one still reflecting his haunting grin. He stood there, towering and menacing, his axe dripping with an unidentified darkness. "You can't run," Victor whispered, his voice distorted and echoing as though coming from every mirror. He raised the axe, his grin unwavering. The hunt had reached its climax, and the maze was there was no escape. Final scene, the theater of the end. Victor's laughter faded, but the weight of his presence still hung heavy in the air. Every step taken toward the park's theater felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to stop anyone from approaching. The theater was a relic in ruins, its torn curtains swaying in the wind while the wooden floor groaned under the weight of time. According to legend, this was where Victor performed his final act for those foolish enough to trespass. The audience was an empty shadow, broken chairs covered in dust, yet it felt as though something unseen was watching. In the dim light of the stage, a pale spotlight suddenly flickered on, illuminating a figure at its center. It was Victor. He stood motionless, his tattered clown costume still bearing faded colors, a ghost of its once vibrant appearance. The axe, now an extension of his being, rested by his boot. "Welcome to my stage," Victor whispered, his voice carrying an otherworldly echo. His hollow, glowing eyes captured the light, two voids that seemed to stare directly into the soul. Slowly, he lifted the axe, pointing it toward the emptiness in front of him, as if inviting someone to join him. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker. The stage groaned as though on the verge of collapse, but Victor remained still. The shredded curtain behind him started to rise, revealing a larger shadow, something alive yet indistinct. The air turned icy, every breath visible as condensation, while a distorted laughter echoed once more. Not just Victor's, but something deeper, older. The distant gates of the park began to creak. There, at the entrance, Victor reappeared as a dark silhouette, even though he remained on the stage. It was as if he was everywhere, an inseparable part of the park. He tilted his head, observing like a predator certain that its prey had nowhere to run. The trees around the theater began to bend toward the stage, as though drawn by his presence. Shards of broken mirrors scattered across the floor began to reflect his figure from countless angles, each more distorted than the last. Victor raised the axe again, now directly above his head, his grotesque grin stretching beyond the limits of possibility. "This isn't a show," he murmured, his voice resonating throughout the park. "It's your end." The last vision before the lights extinguished was of Victor advancing, the entire theater feeling like a trap closing in. After that, silence enveloped the park, but the rumors persisted. Victor didn't seek applause. He sought eternal company.